Well, hello, BookTube, it's Ros, and I'm back after nearly 3 weeks without making a video because my family have all had COVID. Now, that was not a good experience, but the one nice thing about it was that once the worst of the brain fog cleared, I was able to do quite a lot of reading because I couldn't do an awful lot else. And so I've already read, it's I think the 14th of November, and I basically kind of read everything I planned to in November, even though I made a video saying, had I been over ambitious in my November plans. So that's lovely. And that means that I can do an early wrap up of the reading that I've done for IndigAthon. So that's a month of reading that is a read along, encouraging us to read things by Indigenous writers from North America or around the world. Indigenous writers from communities who've been marginalised by settlers. Yeah. And the hosts are Bear at Et Brody and Michelle at Thor Wants Another Letter. So I've read 4 things for IndigAthon: a novel, a collection of poetry, a non-fiction book that I'll explain more, and a play. Now, I'm not going to talk about the play because I talked about that with Sean and Tilly, and there's going to be a video about that soon, which Sean is kindly editing. So I'm going to talk about the other 3. And before I do anything else and say anything more about them, I'm going to do an upfront apology for the fact that I will undoubtedly mangle some of the Indigenous language, names and words that I use in this video, and I've tried to look things up, but sometimes you can't always find things, and sometimes the right version just doesn't stick, especially when you've got kind of COVID brain. So the 3 things that I am going to talk about brought me to 3 extraordinarily creative and interesting women writers from Indigenous background from North America. And 2 of those are contemporary, and those were absolute 5-star reads for me. So I'm so glad to have been sort of brought to those books by this readathon rather. The third is an older book, and I'd say it's was perhaps a 4-star read, but by a 5-star personality, and I'm going to tell you more about that person. So the 3 things that I'm going to tell you about are Legends of Vancouver by Pauline Johnson or Tekahionwake, Noopiming by Leanne, Betasamosake. Oh gosh, you see, I'm failing already. Betasamosake, Simpson. There we go. I got it. Betasamosake, Simpson. And Layli Long Soldier's book of poetry. Whereas, so I'm going to start with this one. I'm going to start with Pauline because this was a curious little book, a lovely book, a 4-star book, should we say. But what an interesting woman. And also I'll tell you a bit more about her because I love to tell you a story, don't I? So Pauline was born in 1861 on the Six Nations Grand River Reserve in what's now Ontario, the state of Ontario in Canada. Now, one of the great things about IndigAthon for me is that it sort of leads me into bits of history or whatever that I didn't otherwise know. So you may already know all about the Six Nations, but I didn't. So I'm going to tell you something to make sure that you at least know as much as I do now. So the Six Nations, originally 5 nations, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, and they were sort of Haudenosaunee people, so Mohawk and Seneca and so on. A number of them chose to fight on the British side in the American Revolutionary War, and they did that because they hoped and believed that would potentially protect them against further sort of encroachment by white settlers in their territory. Obviously, that didn't quite work out according to plan, did it? The British lost, and they found themselves on the wrong side. And the British sort of effectively offered some kind of reparation by offering to resettle them in what was on the other side of the border of what would now be Canada. Not that it was exactly called that, but you know what I mean. Very often on the border, and so they were kind of being used partly to keep that border safe, I guess. And a group of Mohawk people and plus some other Six Nation bands agreed to settle on an area that became known as Six Nations Reserve in as I say, what is now Ontario. And of course, that land was bought from, but what did that mean? Other Indigenous people, the Indigenous people that were already there, but that's a whole other story, isn't it? And I think to an extent they've sort of addressed that, the Six Nations have since. But yes, so 1784, there's a treaty that allocates this area of land to these people, predominantly Mohawk, but a mixture. And amongst the Mohawk families that moved there was a chap called Tekahionwake, and he was Pauline's great-grandfather. Now, when he'd been baptised, he took the surname Johnson from his British sort of godfather and sponsor, as it were. So that's where the surname Johnson, Pauline Johnson, comes from. So that's her great-grandfather. Her grandfather and father were both Mohawk leaders in that area on the reserve, and they were both people that chose to learn English and take a role in sort of sort of a leadership and negotiating role, I suppose, for the people of the Six Nations Reserve. And her father, George, he acted as an interpreter and a negotiator. And one of the people that he did sort of interpreting for was for the Anglican mission, like the who were operating on the reserve. And as he was doing that, he encountered the sister-in-law of the Anglican priest who ran the mission, and a young woman who was English, come over from England, from Bristol, called Emily. And George and Emily hit it off and decided to get married, much to the horror of both families. But they did, and they had 4 children, one of which was Pauline. And the children, they continued to live there on the reserve, and the children were brought up. They deliberately brought the children up to experience both their cultures, as it were. Although, because Mohawk is a matrilineal society, the children, couldn't be part of a clan, but nevertheless, they sort of had they had both heritages, as it were, as mixed heritage children. So Pauline was born in 1861 on the reserve, and she was educated in both English and Mohawk sort of traditions, probably with more of a tendency towards the English side. It's a bit hard to tell, I suppose, in retrospect. But she was very close to her grandfather, who was known as like an orator and a storyteller, and absorbed that, and that sort of influenced her choice of what she would write about when she became a writer, because she did. She grew up to become a writer. And when her father died when she was 23, like the sort of classic Victorian new woman, she basically decided that she would support herself and her mother through her writing and through performing. And this is where it gets really interesting, I suppose, because as a performer, she really used her two identities, and made a very deliberate choice to do that, I suppose. She used to do her performances of her poetry and stories in two acts. And in the first act, she'd come on in her sort of Mohawk persona, as it were, and do things from that sort of that drew on that tradition, I guess. And then in the second half, she'd come on as the English lady and do her writing that drew on that tradition. Looking at it with 21st century eyes, I think she was presenting a kind of exciting, exotic, but yet safe face of sort of Indigenous culture, predominantly for a European settler audience. And she knew that was a deliberate choice. You know, she was using her English side and the fact that she, you know, knew that she had the manners and the language of you know, the English lady, as it were, but to very consciously bring sort of Indigenous rights issues and into her writing, and to, I guess, I suppose, you know, she saw herself as bridging those cultures and looking for some sort of reconciliation between them. Obviously, this led her to a number of what we would see as quite tricky compromises, I think, and I think that was unavoidable. This book, Legends of Vancouver, she wanted it to be called Legends of the Capilano, but she lost that argument, you know. Vancouver is the name of a sort of sailor from Norfolk that went and sailed down the coast of Canada, and, you know, it's got nothing to do with where these legends come from. Anyway, so she became a really well-known poet in her day, very popular, very well thought of, seen as, you know, part of the sort of establishing a Canadian literature, a distinct Canadian literature at the time, you know. So, you know, we're talking the, you know, late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. After she died, she faded rather, I suppose, and didn't get a lot of recognition, you know, in the early part of the 20th century. But as people started to get interested, I suppose, in sort of feminist perspectives, and as Indigenous authors were coming and writing was sort of coming to the fore, then she's had a sort of a new a rethinking of her reputation as in effect an early woman Indigenous author, or someone who certainly sort of had that as part of her identity. She was very clear about where she stood about it. I'm going to read you something that she wrote about herself. She said, "There are those who think they pay me a compliment by saying I'm just like a white woman. I'm Indian, and my aim, my joy, my pride is to sing the glories of my people." So she identified herself as Mohawk. That was the side of herself that she wanted to embrace and honour, I suppose. So how, in that case, did she end up writing a book, the book that I read, called Legends of Vancouver, which is not Ontario, not Mohawk, but the, you know, Squamish people, stories of the Squamish band or Capilano, in the, there was a coastal Salish people. I find the sort of different identities and classification and different languages, you know, is you know, it's sometimes it's challenging sometimes to get your head around all of that. But yeah, Pacific Northwest. Okay, so yeah, why? Well, she made her career performing and so on, but in 1909 she retired and moved to the young city of Vancouver, and there she had a particular friendship with Chief Joe Capilano, so that's the Squamish band, who lived in the sort of Capilano area, which is to the north of what we now know as Vancouver. And they'd met in 1906 in London, of all places, where she was performing and he was attempting to petition King Edward the Seventh about the rights of his people and other, with a couple of other Salish chiefs. Unsuccessfully, but, well, what a surprise. So they had a little late blossoming friendship there, and he told her some of his stories, the stories of his people. He was seriously ill with tuberculosis at this point, and there's a bit of her kind of like capturing something that was, before he died. She also, in fact, had breast cancer and was also in the last years of her life, and but they're the sort of the roots of this book. They were written initially as articles to go in the local newspaper, and then because she was very ill and running out of money, her friends got together to kind of help some of them get put in a book. It's a curious little book, and I don't know how literally these stories were Chief Joe Capilano's stories. I mean, some of them aren't his. She introduces the ones that are his stories, and then she talks about ones she got from other people that she met and spoke to. She brings a sort of her poetic sensibility to the stories, I suppose. There's a lot of memoir. In it, like they're each like little tales of a particular experience or encounter that she had, or an outing with Chief Joe. Some of them are they're almost like travel or nature writing. Some of it, because often the stories relate to a particular sort of feature of the landscape and an explanation of how that came to be. It's delightful, absolutely delightful. I really enjoyed reading it. It's not kind of like mind-blowing literature, but it has a very special charm, I suppose. It was published in 1911. She died in 1913, age 53. Chief Joe Capilano died a couple of years before that. Her funeral was the largest public funeral that there had yet been in Vancouver. It was a sort of like almost like a state funeral, if you know what I mean. And also a lot of Squamish people chose to come and attend her funeral. So, at that time, she was a star, I guess. And I really enjoyed rediscovering her as she gathered from this. Now, the other two things that I want to tell you about, I'm going to do a little bit faster. But I'm going to start off the two. I'm going to start with Noopiming by Leanne. Betasamosake. Come on, Ros, get this right. Betasamosake. That's it. Betasamosake. Simpson, and this is a Anishinaabe author, artist, singer, lyricist, and writer. And what a wonderful book, and what a tremendous reading experience this was. Now, it's a little bit of a booktube darling at the moment, I think, this book. No, not that lots of people have read it, but I think, most people that read it are just bowled over by it. So there's some other really nice reviews of it on booktube already. But the one that I'm going to link to below, and that I would draw your attention to if you are interested in this book, is by Danny of Thunderbird Woman Reads, and she is herself Anishinaabe, and what she explains beautifully is what this book means to her, and what she reminded me really helpfully, I guess, as well as sort of summarising the book and you know, helping make sense of it, perhaps, is that when I come to this book and read it, I'm reading it as a guest. Does that make sense? You know, like this book was not written for me. You know, Simpson writes for Anishinaabe audience first, and then the rest of us that read it can enjoy that and appreciate that. But I guess Danny's advice is to not try to understand it all, or not try and sort of necessarily analyze it as you would a sort of a novel from a different tradition. So, and that's, I think, really helpful understanding in this book, because you know, she says don't get too high up on the form. Now, I actually found the form really, really interesting because it really helps you understand how Simpson wants you to read and focus on different sort of parts. So some are kind of more extended bits of prose, some are just a single line, and when it's just a single line, that really, you know, it kind of sets it apart and makes you really think of it in a different way. I think it's really important to read a physical copy of this book so that you see that and understand that. And I know one booktuber who I love dearly, and is a reader who really, you know, reads widely, but yet he found it boring. That it's Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and a complete turn off. And then he realised that he had read it as an audiobook, and that just wouldn't work. Terrible mistake. What's it about? It's about living as an Anishinaabe person in urban Canadian environment, about, you know, living in Toronto or the Greater Toronto area, and yet holding on to or recovering from your elders a distinct sort of Anishinaabe culture and heritage and connection with nature and so on. I can't really do it justice. The main character is frozen in Lake Ontario, in effect, and then the story emerges through these sort of surrounding characters that are almost like aspects of that main character, but are also kind of archetypes. So like one is caribou, one's maple tree. You get the old man and the old woman that are like elder figures. And you get little different voices, I suppose, that come together to talk about that, sort of identity and culture, and sustaining that in a kind of settler dominated society. I love the characters. I love the language. I was very grateful to find an Ojibwe online dictionary so that I could look up lots of words, because the language in this is just tremendous. But you know, sometimes it's not written for you, and you have to go and sort of find that out to make sense of that. I've made it sound rather so serious and pious. There's a deep sadness in the book. There's a deep also humour, wonderful. One of my favourite sort of parts of the book is we're with geese. We're in the minds of the geese, and geese that stick to a traditional goose migration pattern, and their views of geese that have sort of assimilated and settled and choose not to maintain those traditions. Obviously a metaphor, but also just brilliant and funny and delightful. The raccoons, oh, you can love the raccoons. Trash pandas, as they're cruelly called. It recovers the dignity of the trash panda, I'll tell you. I really can't recommend this book strongly enough, to be honest. but be ready for a different reading experience, and one that kind of brings together both poetry and prose, and in a very special way. Which brings me to my third IndigAthon choice, which was, and if this one was sort of prose with elements of poetry, the other, Whereas by Layli Longsoldier, is poetry with elements of prose, as it happens. Now, Layli Longsoldier is a writer and activist. She's Oglala Lakota background, heritage, and what a brilliant poetry collection this is. It's her first book. It came out in 2017. No, I think she's published some things before, but her first collection of poetry. It's kind of about, I'm going to sound a bit pretentious here. It's about cultural erasure and cultural survival. But to put it more literally, she was inspired by hearing about the 2009 Congressional Apology to Native People, which was, came out in 2009, but is a very kind of mealy-mouthed apology in many ways, in that it's never been said aloud, it's never been widely publicised, and that was her inspiration for this book of poetry. And it's kind of like a response to that. And that's where the name comes from, Whereas, because you might think, oh, why is it called Whereas? And she kind of explains that in one of the poems. So I'm going to read you this to explain it. Whereas I query my uneasiness with the statement, native peoples are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I shift in my seat, a needle in my back. Although unalienable, their rights I cannot legally claim if placed within a whereas statement, meaning whatever comes after the word whereas and before the semicolon in a congressional document falls short of legal grounds, is never cause to sue the government's courts say. And so she goes on. And so there's a whole series of poems in this book that all begin with the word whereas. And yeah, she's kind of, I suppose, she's looking at what does an apology mean? What makes an apology? But it's broader than that as well. Another key theme in the book is motherhood. And because her experience of motherhood, I think, brought to mind her responsibility to kind of prevent cultural erasure, to kind of pass things on to the next generation. This is another book where if at all possible, I would get a physical copy. I didn't. I got an e-copy. I read it on a tablet so that I could see it, because how it's laid out on the page really matters in these poems. She does very clever things with language, and plays with that, with layout and with gaps and blanking things out. And I mean, you need to see it to understand what she's trying to do. I will come back to Whereas for a Poetry Thursday video this month, I hope. That's my plan. If I'm well enough and can cope with that, as well as being back at work, which I need to do. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm just going to say a huge thank you to the IndigAthon hosts for making me discover these three wonderful women writers that have brought so much richness to the last couple of weeks for me. And I hope you are having some wonderful IndigAthon reading from Indigenous authors too. And if not, well, it doesn't have to be IndigAthon to read Indigenous writers, does it? So how about next month?